This is a sub-media production.
Hello, and welcome to Circle A. I'm your host, JR. For this episode, we'll be revisiting an interview we did back in 2017 with anarchist author and theorist Peter Gelderloos, where he spoke to us about counterinsurgency strategy and how it is used by governments, not just in foreign wars of occupation, but also against their national population at all times. We started off by asking him for his definition of counterinsurgency and how it tends to play out on the ground.
Counterinsurgency is basically the constant war that states carry out against their own populations. They are efforts at pacification in order to manage conflict and ensure the stability and continuity of governance. Basically, counterinsurgency as a state philosophy arose as specialists working for the state, as state institutions, analyzed their failures and weaknesses in the anti-colonial struggles of the 50s and 60s and the particularly urban and other domestic struggles within powerful colonizing states of the 60s and 70s. So the British experience trying to put down the anti-colonial uprising in Kenya, the French experience trying to put down the anti-colonial uprising in Algeria, experiences of resisting or trying to put down the movements of May 1968, the Black Liberation Movement, and others in the United States, and so forth. Basically, after a long time, state actors and specialists working for the state had come to believe state mythology about the nature of the state, that the state was inevitable, natural, good, a force for peace, for bringing people up, for improving people's living conditions. And so understandably, they thought that the nature of society under the state was to be at peace. And that this peace was only interrupted by outside agitators, by special actors. So therefore, understandably, policing philosophy prior to this idea of counterinsurgency focused on identifying and excluding these outside agitators and preserving or protecting society's natural state. In light of their failures in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they realized that actually the natural state of society under the state, under state authority, was conflict. That people will always develop or tend towards an antagonistic relationship with those who are trying to govern them, because governing, as we all know, means exploitation, it means surveillance, it means control, it means fucking people over, in a word. The counterinsurgency philosophy is an evolution of state thinking, recognizing that governance is always conflictive, it's always antagonistic. So in order to maintain stability and continuity for governance, they have to permanently manage conflict. They can't think of conflict as something to be avoided, but something that has to be permanently managed. And according to Frank Kitson and some of the other first military theorists around counterinsurgency, the objective is to maintain the level of conflict at the lowest levels, at levels of simple dissidence or nonviolence, and not allow those conflicts to evolve to more insurrectional or revolutionary levels. So the state itself understands the sort of hierarchy of threats, from simple dissidence to non-violent protest and resistance, to more combative forms of resistance, which are capable of threatening state power. So the purpose of counterinsurgency is to maintain the conflict at these lower, non-threatening levels. Let's see what this tells us about the nature of the state. Of course, that it's our enemy. This certainly gives credence to the anarchist idea of social war, which is that the state constitutes warfare against us, against governed populations, permanently and constantly.
Next up, we asked Peter to define the historic process of militarization and talk about the ways it has played out across the ages during early state formation, as well as the modern parallels that exist in the world today.
Militarization is a process of encouraging acceptance for authoritarianism and hierarchy within society. So it basically creates more legitimacy for ideas of governance, creates more popular participation in governance, and more popular acceptance for the diverse forms of authority and hierarchy that states need in order to function. So it's a process of militarizing society, creating military discipline and military norms within society. Looking back at early states, so going back 1,000 or thousands of years, this is sort of a modification of the rival states polity, which is one of the anthropological explanations for state formation, where within a sort of regional system you have different hierarchical societies that are each becoming more hierarchical as they engage in warfare with one another. So they're seeking competitive advantage against the neighboring society by becoming more militaristic, more hierarchical, developing more techniques of warfare, and above all, military organization within the society. Basically, that's a model for explaining how it happens, but not exactly why it happens. There's some problems with that model because it's easy to assume that when you have societies that are neighbors that engage in warfare, that it's inevitable that they develop states. It's inevitable that they become more hierarchical. In fact, there's strong military advantages to being a decentralized society. The rival states model is the rival polities model of state formation is most effective at sort of describing what happens when you have two authoritarian societies that are neighbors, where they already have some kind of pre-existing elite, and those elites use these processes of warfare as an opportunity to win more power, to increase hierarchization, which is already present in their societies. I chose the name of militarization, actually borrowing it from debates that were happening here in the Spanish state in the 20th century during the Spanish Civil War. Militarización was the sort of big debate about whether or not to militarize the militias. These were volunteer workers' militias formed by anarchists, by communists outside of the Communist Party, Trotskyists and other dissident communists. And these were the forces that were the first line fighting against fascists for the first half year of the Spanish Civil War. The government, the Spanish Republican government, with the Stalinists, the socialists, other left-wing factions, were very threatened by these militias because it completely undermined, it destroyed the state monopoly on organized violence. They wanted to get rid of these militias at any cost, even if it meant losing the war. So the big debate was that a regular army would be more effective. Spain needed a regular army. So that was militarization. So instead of just treating militarization as something that happened among Neolithic societies thousands of years ago, I wanted to underline that it's a constant dynamic in state formation, which is also in itself a constant process. It's not that states formed a long time ago and that was it. States are constantly crumbling. They're constantly falling apart. They inevitably exist in an antagonistic relationship with their own societies and with their neighbors, so they have to constantly reform themselves. In that way, state formation is something of a constant process. So state authority in much of the Iberian Peninsula had collapsed with this partially failed fascist coup attempt in July 1936. Large parts of the Iberian Peninsula, of the territory governed by the Spanish state, started being self-organized. And so militarization was the principal strategy that the state used to reassert its authority. It can also be seen, maybe on a smaller degree, in other more recent examples. With post-war, like post-World War II democratic societies, One major element of militarization has decreased. That's the element of popular participation in military processes. With the society of the spectacle, we're more meant to be spectators to these processes. So militarization today is more present as an acceptance of military norms for the organizing of society or the presence of military forces in daily democratic life. So that's an opportunistic use of terrorist attacks from France to Italy to the United States, getting people to accept the presence of the military in the streets, of armed soldiers, police with automatic weapons in the streets, getting to accept that as normal, getting to accept that as anything other than what it is, which is a direct threat against all of us. It's a constant boot in our face, to borrow a phrase from Orwell. But what is less present in democratic societies of today is this sort of citizen recruiting, this recruiting of direct participation in more militaristic activities among the citizenry. Nowadays, whereas in previous generations, our duty as citizens was to sign up, either directly join the military or in other ways take on these roles of soldiers at the orders of society's elite. Nowadays, our duty in the face of these processes of militarization is to go on being consumers. So keep buying, keep shopping, don't be afraid. Of course, it needs to be mentioned the duty of being snitches, the duty of surveilling our neighbors. But beyond that, there isn't so much of a call to duty. So that's definitely a change in the strategy of how militarization works. It's a change related to sort of post-war democratic societies that are more consumer-based societies. It remains to be seen how that affects a state's possibilities for social control, right? Because usually, as states evolve, they try to become stronger, but also there's always a give and take. As societies push back, there are certain weapons or tools that states sort of back away from. Since we haven't had a major democratic state just completely collapse, since World War II, we haven't seen yet if this more pampered consumer mentality means that states have also surrendered or lost certain weapons. When push comes to shove, if you have a crisis as extreme as the one that was affecting multiple democratic societies in the 30s that eventually led to the 20s and 30s that eventually led to the rise of fascism, will states be able to mobilize their citizens again the same way? That remains to be seen. Maybe because of this sort of new pampered, passive spectator's take on what it means to be a citizen to a democracy, maybe that's also changed people's basic values and expectations of what the state can ask them to do. And maybe that means that in a way states have also become weaker by losing certain tools and weapons while gaining other ones related to social control during times of economic growth, or whether states have become stronger in an absolute sense and have gained new weapons and tools related to the society, to spectator and consumer society, without losing these other older, more brutal weapons. And the successes and failings of different neo-fascist and white supremacist movements in different countries, I think, give some indications as to whether that old threat is still there or to whether it's actually reduced in scope. But like I said, it sort of remains to be seen what the answer on that is.
In modern Western democracies, the state rarely resorts to overt military force, preferring instead to rely on so-called less lethal police violence, infiltration, mass surveillance, and imprisonment. Just as harmful as these repressive mechanisms, though, is the ability for governments to recuperate the efforts of people who were initially seeking to undermine it. An uncomfortably stark example of this phenomenon is the United States parole system, which was originally contrived by critics of prison as a way of reducing incarceration and moving towards alternative justice models. Within less than a generation of its inception, it has become a pillar of the prison industrial complex, and all those years of well-intentioned work are now serving to keep far more people in jail for far longer.
So repression is basically the attempts by the state to punish and to enclose and to isolate and therefore neutralize, or to neutralize through liquidation, threats to its authority. Recuperation are the attempts to integrate threats to authority, to redirect them towards non-threatening modes, or modes that even regenerate, reform, or modify state power in a way that makes states more able to respond to similar threats. It's a bit too much of a simplification to think of them as the carrot and the stick. Although there is certainly that dynamic, the state has the ability to both punish and reward. But I think one of the primary, or some of the primary dynamics are enclosure, identification, and integration, or reabsorption. So that's really a lot more complex than just like carrot and stick. One good example would be the Can Vies riots here in Barcelona a few years ago, 2014. Both the state and the media were trying to enclose what was happening. They were trying to isolate it, to keep it from spreading, so they could more easily control it or eliminate it. The police enclosure failed. People beat the police on the streets through combative tactics, through spreading, through mobility. Once the police could no longer, once they showed that they didn't have the capabilities of physically or violently enclosing what was happening, in the end it was actually the media enclosure that functioned. The media enclosure functioned by convincing people, both within and without the movement, what those riots were about, what was happening, why people were taking to the streets, why people were breaking the rules of democratic normality and social peace. So they basically sold this convincing narrative that those riots were about one social center. That gave the city government grounds to negotiate, because previously everyone was refusing any kind of direct formal negotiations with the city government. Therefore, if they weren't going to negotiate, if they weren't going to make demands, the city government could offer nothing that would put an end to the riots. Of course, the riots were about much more than one social center. Many of the people who were in the streets had never even gone to that social center. Maybe they didn't even like it. The riots were about our access to the city. Who owns the city? Does it belong to the tourists, the property owners, the cops, the politicians, or does it belong to neighbors, to immigrants, to regular people? Once the media could effect that enclosure, that sort of semantic enclosure, then the city could negotiate, even though they had no one else at the negotiating table. They could give us Can Vies, they could cancel the eviction of that one social center, and then achieve an end to the rioting and keep the rioting from spreading in an insurrectionary way throughout the whole city. And that worked. So that was a way of recuperating the riots by changing their meaning and integrating them into a narrative that made sense in a democratic framework, allowing people to return to normality, taking out the most subversive elements of what was happening, which was actually raising this question of who owns the city? Who does the city belong to? Who do the streets belong to? So through that media enclosure, through that form of sort of ideological or semantic recuperation, the state was able to make that very subversive, ultimately revolutionary question go away. So recuperation and repression, they work hand in hand. And sometimes they work in parallel, sometimes they work as sort of different options that a state has access to. Often the right wing tends more to use repression. The left wing tends more to use recuperation, but that's not by any means true. A lot of times, actually, the left wing is more capable at when they're in power, at engaging in police repression because of certain recuperative processes that are happening simultaneously. So, for example, the government of Evo Morales in Bolivia, a very left-wing government that came from a political party that was created by the grassroots, they were more effective at using police repression because they had already divided social movements by integrating many social movements institutionally into government, giving people jobs, giving people funding, creating these discourses that convinced people that now this new government was on their side. So when they used repression, the only people who responded to that repression were the people specifically targeted, specific indigenous groups, specific anarchist groups, etc. And they could even use other left-wing groups like labor unions to attack groups that were being critical towards government policies. Whereas previously, when the right wing attacked any sector of these social movements, everyone came back out into the streets, they shut cities down, they went head-to-head with the military. So there's really no strict, simple equivalence between repression, recuperation, right wing, left wing, stick and carrot. These are simultaneous processes that operate through ideas of integration in narratives, integration in society, integration in institutions, enclosure, which is very important, being able to isolate people either physically or in terms of at the level of identities, at the level of semantics. And then keeping subversive questions from being posed or subversive practices from spreading. Squatting, for example. Once squatting became an urban identity, it lost most of its subversive value because it was no longer a practice that anyone could use that questioned the very idea of housing and of private property, and became simply what another urban subculture does, part of their identity. So once squatting turned into squatters as a specific identity, it was largely recuperated. And that, of course, went hand in hand with specific repressive practices, criminalizing squatting and so forth.
States are formed and continue to exist as a hierarchy of claims on a given territory. The most foundational of these, the one upon which all others are built, is the ability to monopolize force across the land base. Once this has been established, the less overtly violent aspects of statecraft can be organized. After enough time has passed and the effects of nationalism take root, physically mobilizing the distribution of troops can be de-emphasized in favor of things like media and educational propaganda. This leads to a situation where maintaining the legitimacy of state institutions becomes one of, if not the most important part of counterinsurgency. This is especially true within a democracy.
Democracy encourages participation in government, and it also allows the construction of a consensus among the elite, manufacturing of common interests. When we talk about the elite, we're not talking about a shadowy conspiracy or any homogenous group. We're talking about elite actors with more access to power, either in economic terms, political terms, cultural terms. And they have very different interests, some sectors of the elite from others. For example, Trump's Muslim ban in general didn't adversely affect the traditional sectors of the capitalist economy, like the finance sector, the real estate sector, but it really did hurt the tech sector because companies like Google, Facebook, Apple need to be able to recruit intellectual capital in their terms on a worldwide scale. And so it's actually hurting them if you're cutting out like such a large proportion of the world's population. So with democratic government, you encourage debate among elite sectors. You encourage debate about the best strategies of social control, the best strategies of protecting and encouraging the capitalist economy. You also protect capitalists from popular anger by producing this mechanism of recuperation, of constantly switching back and forth between different political parties, and therefore getting people to direct their anger at specific political parties rather than at the ruling class as a bloc. Democracy also encourages a liberal Western concept of the individual as this isolated unit with rights that pertain to public participation, which means participation within a centralized and hierarchical sphere of decision-making, rather than this organic being in the world who exists according to communal relationships, according to relationships with the natural environment. The liberal individual has no right to a home. They have a right to look for work and try to sell their labor power in order to pay for housing, which is different from a home. The liberal individual breathes on an individual basis simply with their lungs, whereas actual living human beings, like other organisms, only breathe as part of a pretty complex network, which includes also forests, algae, other living beings, and so forth. So in other words, you can poison the liberal individual legally, as long as you're not going and directly injecting them with a poison. Then that would be murder, but you can kill them by destroying the things that they require for their well-being. And that's operating at a deeper basis through public education, state-run education, through all of these institutions that produce the mythology of Western civilization and convince us that we are these other things, these individuals, which is kind of a strange construction. But yeah, definitely in a lot of ways, democracies are a more stable form of governance. So as long as people are not in the streets and overpowering the police on a frequent basis and showing their ability to overthrow the government and requiring the military to be brought out in the streets, most capitalists, most business interests prefer democracy because of the stability that it provides. However, in the last few decades, more and more democracies have been able to avail themselves of extreme forms of punishment based on these sorts of states of exception. So you have perpetual imprisonment, you have extreme forms of punishment that can be used against subversive political actors if they can be portrayed as terrorists. So this sort of anti-terrorism politics, which actually comes from certain post-fascist societies, has been incorporated into democracy. So now democracies have even more tools for repression. So they don't need to revert to dictatorships, to military dictatorships with as much frequency. Because if you look at like 100 years ago, or in some places even 50 years ago, the idea of locking someone up for life, of perpetual imprisonment, was seen as really barbaric, as extreme, as unacceptable. And so the democracies were more infused with this idea of amnesty, which has pretty much completely gone out the window. So nowadays, democratic governments have all of their historical advantages and much fewer of their disadvantages in terms of repressive powers.
Submedia is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. For more great anarchist content, check out channelzeronetwork.com.
Yeah. This is M1, M.A. Uno, M.A. de la gente comprende y entiende, you feel me? I'm one half of Dead Prez, to tell it like it is, everything is political rap duo. Here holding my middle finger up to imperialism worldwide. And you in tune right now to the rebel beat.
The Rebel Beat is a monthly podcast of radical political music across different genres and across different continents. It's the mixtape to a riot against police brutality. It's your nightly newscast set to bass and beats. It's protest anthems from Hong Kong to Istanbul to Ferguson to Montreal. Give it a listen at rebelbeatradio.com or subscribe today on all your favorite podcast platforms.
Diving right back into our interview with Peter Gelderloos, we asked about the specific examples of counterinsurgency that played out in Spain in 2015 via the two policing operations known as Pandora and Piñata. He touched on the different discourses and tactics used in the lead-up, during the operations themselves, and in the ensuing years.
At a certain point, around 2014, there was a change in the repressive discourses of the Spanish state. Prior to that, the internal enemy that they identified were the anti-sistema, was the term that they used, the anti-system people. This lumped together squatters, the radical part of the independence movements in Catalonia, Galicia, other places, anarchists, or rather the sort of extra institutional part of the anarchists, maybe making a division between like a difference between responsible anarchists and anarchists who participated in these historically hard to question organizations like the CNT, and then these more like autonomous anarchists. After a certain point, especially when you started seeing really combative large general strikes that were kind of getting out of the state's control, and when you had increasingly effective anarchist participation in a number of struggles, the housing struggle, the struggle against these austerity measures, the state pretty dramatically shifted gears and started talking about anarchist terrorism and anarchists as the internal enemy. The media really went into overdrive, manufacturing stories about violent anarchists from Italy coming over and teaching Spanish or Catalan anarchists how to riot, things like that. And I would say that even though they were discursively targeting anarchists, of course the state was looking at the situation as a whole. I think they were also maybe trying to train non-anarchist members of social movements to identify certain combative tactics, which anyone can use, rioting, sabotage, and so forth, fighting with police. They were training people to identify those tactics with anarchists, so that those who didn't personally identify as anarchists would distance themselves from those tactics. So on the one hand, it was an identification of anarchists as a principal threat, but anarchists, on the other hand, shouldn't get too proud or cocky or think of ourselves as the only threat to the Spanish state, of course, because this was also a sort of identitarian strategy to get other sectors of the movements to step back from the anarchists and leave the anarchists isolated, both as concrete individuals and organizations who were arrested and facing repression, and also as practices. Practices that could be defined as anarchistic because they're horizontal, because they're combative, but practices that really anyone could use and that increasing numbers of people were using. At least in Catalonia, the repression of Operation Pandora, which was actually two distinct operations, didn't have the desired effect. Instead of stepping back from anarchists, lots of people came to the support of anarchists with this sort of classic and still quite effective strategy of we are all anarchists, we are all X, X being whoever's being repressed in a given moment. And so that defeated, I think, the primary push or the primary objective of repression, which is enclosure, isolation. After those repressive campaigns, anarchists were less isolated rather than more isolated. But still, repression has secondary objectives that it can fulfill of making people afraid, exhausting people, because there's a whole lot of work that has to be done when our friends and comrades get arrested. There's raising money, there's getting lawyers, there's sending letters and books and packages to them while they're in prison, arranging visits, supporting their family members, supporting their immediate circles, repairing the doors of the houses and social centers that police have busted into, replacing all of the electronics, laptops, etc., that police systematically steal, and cash that police systematically steal when they conduct these raids. And it's pretty hard to avoid that repression is exhausting. So even if you can defeat the fear factor, even if you can make people feel more bold and more able to stand up to police repression, and even if you can get a lot of other people to come out in the streets to support you, to identify with you, you can't really keep repression from being exhausting and maybe becoming our primary focus. So we forget about some of our other projects and we focus on the repression. However, we can adopt more effective strategies at minimizing the exhaustion, looking at ways that people who are locked up can continue participating in the struggles, giving more importance to questions of care, finding more sustainable practices of struggle instead of like this trying to fulfill this constant rhythm of protest and antagonism. Also, putting more emphasis in the organization of our vital needs, the organization of daily life, so that our struggle isn't just sapping energy, it's also giving us more energy and allowing to put communal relations, put our ideas into practice. So the anti-terrorist operations directed against anarchists here, Pandora and Piñata, and ICE, were they were partially effective in terms of exhausting people, in terms of causing certain projects to shut down, but they certainly didn't achieve their primary objectives. And some groups did find effective strategies at sustaining themselves as they responded to repression. Since then, there haven't been new anti-terrorism campaigns against anarchists in a couple of years. We're sort of waiting to see how their strategies will change, what the next measures will be. In Barcelona, simple economics is proving to be quite effective, forcing people out of their neighborhoods, raising rents, bringing in a whole bunch of tourists, making the city uninhabitable. And that's something that people here, I don't think, have found a satisfactory response to. Although, of course, there's lots of campaigns, lots of attempts. So in the meantime, we're sort of waiting. The police. I mean, for a while, we were going through this rhythm of every year, even twice a year, a new round of major arrests under the anti-terrorism law. For now, that seems to have stopped, to have run its course. And there are all sorts of repressive measures that are built into capitalism, that are built into democratic government, that, of course, aren't going anywhere. They haven't disappeared. They haven't abated. People are deploying new strategies, looking for new terrains of struggle and conflict. And as always, the story hasn't come to its end. So.
To close things out, we asked for Peter's take on the importance of anarchists and other radicals learning the theory, principles, and tactics behind state counterinsurgency, and to offer some specific steps for how to turn these lessons into practical strategies on the ground.
The more that we can spread awareness of counterinsurgency beyond anarchist circles, the more support we can win, the more people will understand the methods we use, why we simply choose antagonistic and combative methods vis-a-vis the state. Because once you understand that states organize according to a philosophy of counterinsurgency, ideas of democratic participation are revealed as absurdities. People understand that the state views them as their enemy or as their potential enemy, and certainly as a threat. And so people understand that when we talk about social war, it's not because we like war, we like violence, but because the state started the social war. The existence of the state is a social war. It's constant warfare against all of us. So we can either defend ourselves and fight back, or we can fall in line and accept one form of submission and slavery or another, mediated by our position in various social hierarchies, ranging from gender, citizenship, ethnicity, to race and class and so forth. All of these hierarchies, of course, serving to break people apart, to create, basically to divide and conquer, to create antagonisms within governed populations, and also because they reflect certain philosophies of power. Of course, racism isn't just a simple Machiavellian tool by the state. It also reflects the way that state actors view the world and view the peoples that they colonize or otherwise dominate. And specifically within anarchist circles, if we get more nuanced understandings and encourage more nuanced understandings of how counterinsurgency works, it will certainly help us avoid recuperation. It will help us identify recuperation and know how not to fall into that trap, because more often than not, recuperation works if we participate in it in some way. And it will also help us improve our anti-repressive strategies, especially at the point that we realize that repression is primarily an enclosure mechanism, a mechanism for isolating people. Then we'll begin to put more importance on creating broader social relationships, breaking out of enclosures, avoiding isolation, and certainly giving up on strategies that basically amount to self-isolation. So on the one hand, it encourages more strategies of social engagement and creating relationships that defy enclosure and isolation, relationships with neighbors, relationships with coworkers, relationships with family members, and so forth, presence in different social conflicts. And it also makes it reveals more populist strategies as being ways of participating in our own pacification. It reveals that there's really no way to stay safe, no way to play it safe, and that simply modifying our discourses to arrive to more people, to appeal to a mass audience, is another way of protecting the legitimacy of state institutions by limiting our critiques to only some institutions and not others. It's a way to pacify ourselves and therefore help the state maintain conflict at these lower, more peaceful levels. So yeah, I think an understanding of counterinsurgency allows us to be effectively antagonistic. So neither self-pacifying nor self-isolating. Steps that people can take. Let's see. Spreading discourses, spreading histories, spreading knowledge of what the term social war means, what's the history behind that, and why that's very real, why that's not just a slogan, but a very accurate and rich way of understanding the society that we live in. Other steps have to do with how people respond to repression or to recuperation, how we communicate the relation between different institutions, how we point out the way that seemingly disparate or even diametrically opposed strategies for social control are just that, strategies of social control that are complementary. So for example, in the US, that would be showing how the supposed anti-racism of the media is actually, in terms of like media's response to Trump, is trying to achieve some of the exact same things that Trump and that the KKK in the streets are trying to achieve. For example, the far right wants to protect statues of Confederate military figures, whereas the institutions that are in the process of recovering their legitimacy are willing to abandon General Lee and the statues to unknown Confederate Army soldiers in order to draw a line to protect the statues to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and other slave owners. So sort of trying to draw an ethical line between whether someone was a figure who helped build up the supposedly great state, or whether they were a figure who fought against that state. When really the ethical lines should maybe have something to do with the enslavement of other human beings and things of that nature. But yeah, other steps towards integrating effective counterinsurgency strategies. Increasing lines of learning, solidarity, and sharing between struggles on an international level. The states different states, the US, the United Kingdom, France, they had access to an international range of experiences. They were studying insurgencies in Kenya and in Brixton, in Algeria and in Los Angeles. That's very real. Obviously, we go up against different configurations of power, where we go up against sort of different, a game that's played by somewhat different rules. In certain countries, supposedly the state's not supposed to kill large numbers of people. It does, but it has to hide it much, much better, and it has to give us more rights. In other countries, it's considered acceptable if 100,000 people die every day. So questions of privilege, questions of oppression definitely come into it, but it's still the same system that we're fighting against. It's the same mentality, and we need to build international solidarity that breaks down these divisions, that breaks down these differences, and helps us share lessons, and also helps us identify with one another, because we're fighting against the same machine, and we need to learn more from one another and share resources and share experiences more frequently and at a more intense level.
And that's where we'll leave it. We have been lucky enough to connect with Peter a few times over the years, so stay tuned for more of his great interviews in future episodes. In the meantime, if you want to read more of Peter's perspectives, check out his numerous books, the most recent of which goes even more in depth on the topic of militarization. It's called Worshipping Power, an Anarchist View of Early State Formation. Submedia is entirely funded by our viewers and listeners, so if you're in a position to help out, visit sub.media/donate, or pick up some of our merch at sub.media/gear. If money's tight but you still want to support the show, consider leaving a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, as well as telling a friend or two about why you listen to Circle A.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye.